When we discuss extreme cinema today, our minds naturally travel towards films designed to push boundaries. Violence, sexuality, body horror, psychological cruelty, and taboo. We talk about films such as Cannibal Holocaust, Salò, Martyrs, a Serbian film, and countless others that have been accused of crossing some invisible boundary between acceptable entertainment and something audiences supposedly should not want to see. But decades before most of those films existed, Tod Browning made something extraordinary. In 1932, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer released Freaks, and audiences were horrified. Not because Browning filled the screen with elaborate gore, not because the film contained the sort of explicit sexual imagery that would become possible decades later. What disturbed many people was something considerably more revealing. Browning shared with them real human beings whose bodies were different from theirs and everybody else's. And then he asked the audience to sympathise with them. That distinction is enormously important. Freaks is a 1932 American pre-code drama horror film directed and produced by Tod Browning, the filmmaker who had already achieved enormous success directing Dracula in 1931. But yet, Freaks would become something entirely different. It would become controversial. It would become cut. It would be condemned. It would be refused classification in Britain. It would damage Browning's career. And decades later, it would undergo one of the most fascinating critical resentments in horror history. Before we move on, grab a drink, grab a snack, and enjoy the podcast. The British Film Institute now describes the surviving film as a work that has matured into canonised humanist piece of cinema. The irony is difficult to miss. Something once treated almost as though it were unfit for civilization eventually become recognised as an important piece of film history. But understanding Freaks requires something considerably larger than the movie itself. We need to understand the world its performers come from. We need to talk about the circus. We need to talk about the sideshow. We need to talk about the disability. And we need to talk about the exploitation. And, perhaps most importantly, we need to talk about the people whom paying audiences once queued to stare at. Because the performers and Freaks were not special effects. They were not elaborate prosthetics. Many were established performers who had already spent years working within circus, carnival, and other entertainment. And their histories make Freaks considerably more complicated than simply calling it an exploitation film. Modern audiences tend to have a fairly sanitised idea of what a circus historically represented. Now, a funny side note and a funny side story here, but not a funny side story, if you get my drift. Before I even purchased Freaks on DVD, before I even knew the existence of Tod Browning's Freaks, I watched a documentary. And in this documentary featured some of the people that were featured in Freaks. And it went through their history and it went through their lives in the circus. And my empathy went skyrocketing when I saw this. And when I heard that Tod Browning made a film called Freaks, and in the underground, in the underbelly of extreme cinema, I felt for these people. And so I went into this movie with a little bit of a backstory, knowing what I was about to see. So with that being said, that's just a little side note there for you. But if you mention a circus, and people imagine enormous tents, clowns, trapeze artists, strongmen, acrobats, animals, elephants to be a big one, lions, ringmasters. But alongside the traditional circus developed another form of entertainment, the sideshow. Now, during the 19th and early 20th centuries, travelling carnivals, circuses, dime museums and fairs frequently exhibited people whose bodies, disabilities, medical conditions, ethnicity and appearance were considered unusual. They were marketed using terminology that today can be deeply uncomfortable. So you have human oddities, human curiosities, monstrosities, and inevitably freaks. That word wasn't merely an insult, it became an entertainment category. People paid money to look, and big money. Sideshow promoters understood something about human psychology that remains alive today. People are intensely curious about things they rarely encounter. Now, difference become commercially valuable. Now, I don't know if I can pronounce his name correctly. I'm going to try. But the Smithsonian's, apology if I butchered it, the National Museum of African American History and Culture describes sideshows as secondary attractions travelling alongside circuses or carnivals, exhibiting people who are presented as human oddities, including people with dwarfism, conjoined twins, body modifications, and those who appearance fell outside contemporary ideas of normality. And there lies the first uncomfortable question: were these people performers or were they exhibits? And sometimes the answer was both. Any serious discussion of sideshow history eventually encounters Taylor Barnum. Now, P.T. Barnum became one of the most influential figures in 19th century American entertainment, and his career demonstrates how aggressively human difference could be commercialized. One particular disturbing early example was Joyce Heth. In 1835, Barnum exhibited Heth, an elderly African American woman who was nearly blind and largely paralyzed, while falsely advertising her as the 161-year-old former nurse of George Washington. Heth had previously been enslaved. People paid to see her. Her age, race, physical condition, and supposed connection to American history become part of the spectacle. This is important because sideshow culture cannot be romanticized simply because some performers later achieved financial independence or celebrity. There was exploitation, there was racism, ableism, and there were fabricated biographies. There were promoters deliberately exaggerating medical conditions and inventing exotic origins because a dramatic story sold more tickets. And that still happens to this day. The person standing on the platform was not always being introduced as a person. They were being sold as an experience. Now, I just want to take a step back just for 1 second. This day and age, we don't even have really a circus anymore. because as of late, they used to use animals, and then the animals got banned. When I was a child, they used animals, and I didn't appreciate it. I never went to the circus because of that reason. I don't agree with exploiting animals for entertainment. And most certainly, if those sideshows had been around when I was little, I most certainly would not have wanted to entertain the idea. And it's very easy for people these days to laugh at the movie, to laugh at these people, to even be on the street and laugh at somebody that has got a disability. Please don't be laughing at these people, because they have a much harder life than what you have. And yet, they're the ones always with a smile on their face. So please take this message as you will. If you ever see somebody on the street with a disability, just stop for 1 second and think to yourself, what if that was me? This is what this movie, Freaks, got me to sit back and think about. And not just about the people back in them days, but it could just be me, because I've got a lot of empathy for people. I'm a caring person. I love everybody and each and every one of you that listen to my podcast. I really appreciate you. So if you would like to do something in return to thank me for the podcast, just take a minute when you're on the street and look at these people and just sit back and think, what if that was me? Would you like somebody laughing at you? Ask that question. And if the answer is no, then don't be laughing at that person. Just do that one thing for me. But moving on, it is tempting to divide everyone neatly into victims and exploiters. History rarely behaves itself that conveniently. Now, for some people with significant physical differences or disabilities, conventional employment opportunities in the 19th and early 20th centuries would be extremely limited. Social or the society might refuse someone conventionally employed while simultaneously paying money to see the same individual perform. That is grotesquely contradictory. Yet within that system, some performers develop genuine careers. Some become celebrities, some travelled internationally, some earned substantial incomes, some actively developed staged personas, some regarded themselves as entertainers rather than victims. That does not magically erase exploitation. Instead, it demonstrates why sideshow history deserves something more intelligent than a simple judgment from the comfort of the 21st century. And Freaks captures that contradiction extremely well. Now, this next piece of knowledge was very fascinating to me when I did my research on Tod Browning and the carnivals, the sideshows. And what I found was this, that one reason Freaks feels so unusual is that Tod Browning wasn't experiencing circus culture entirely as an outsider. Before becoming one of Hollywood's most important early horror directors, Browning had personal experience with travelling with entertainment and carnival culture. The BFI notes that Browning drew upon his own youth and experience with sideshow circus culture when developing Freaks. Now that matters. Watch Freaks carefully, and much of the movie isn't actually horror. People eat, people talk, people flirt, people argue, relationships develop, friendships exist, people become jealous, people fall in love, people gossip, and people laugh. The performers exist as a community, and that normality is arguably one of the most radical things about the film, because Browning isn't consistently stopping the narrative to announce, look at these people. Instead, he frequently shows them simply to exist. So it shows them in the movie more behind the scenes in their character developments. Now, at the centre of the story is Hans, a performer with dwarfism who becomes infatuated with Cleopatra, a glamorous trapeze artist. Hans is already involved with Frida, another performer with dwarfism. Cleopatra initially plays with Hans' attraction towards her, but when she discovers that Hans is inherited considerable wealth, flirtation becomes something far more sinister. Cleopatra conspires with Hercules, a circus strongman, to marry Hans and to eventually kill him. The plan is brutally simple: marry him, poison him, take his money. But Hans' circus family eventually discovers what Cleopatra and Hercules is doing, and the people Cleopatra has treated as inferior decide to retaliate. The story therefore performs its clever reversal. The characters initially presented to the audience as physically unusual aren't necessarily the monsters. The conventionally beautiful Cleopatra and physically powerful Hercules become the film's moral monsters. Beauty becomes ugliness and difference becomes community. And the people society has labelled freaks demonstrate loyalty towards one another that the supposedly normal characters lack. Now, one of the famous sequences in Freaks occurs during the wedding celebration. The sideshow performers gather around Cleopatra and symbolically welcome her into the community. Their acceptance is genuine. They are effectively saying, "You married one of us. Therefore, you are now family." Cleopatra's reaction exposes everything about her. She is disgusted. She humiliates Hans. She mocks the performers. The scene transforms what should have been an act of communal acceptance into an act of rejection. And suddenly, the title Freaks begins turning against the audience. Who exactly is the freak? The person whose body looks different, or the person capable of cruelty towards someone because of their body looks different? That question is why the movie still works more than 90 years later. And one of the most important aspects of the film is Browning's casting. Rather than having Hollywood actors imitate physical disabilities through makeup and prosthetics, numerous performers came directly from circus and sideshow backgrounds. Among them were Harry Earles as Hans and Daisy Earles as Frida. They were a conjoined twins, Daisy and Violet Hilton. Johnny Eck, I believe that's how you pronounce his name, appeared in the film. Prince Randian appeared, and I can't pronounce Schlitzie. I can't pronounce it. Schlitzie, I don't know, appeared. I do apologise. Olga Roderick, known professionally as his bearded lady, appeared. Frances O'Connor, an armless performer, appeared. Martha Morris, another armless performer, appeared. Peter Robinson, who performed under living skeleton persona, was among the sideshow performers. Josephine Joseph performed with an androgynous half-woman, half-man stage identity. Now, the collection's cast records preserve just how extensive Browning's sideshow ensemble actually was. There was not simply anonymous bodies placed behind leading actors. Many had identities and careers outside of Freaks. This is worth remembering whenever the film is reduced to that, the old movie with strange looking people. The people had names, the people had careers, and they had histories. Now, Johnny Eck, I believe that's how you pronounce his last name, is perhaps one of the most visually recognisable performers in Freaks. Born with sacral ageness, Eck had an extremely shortened lower body and become known professionally as the half-boy. But describing Eck purely through his physical condition completely misses the person. He became entertainment. He was associated with sideshow performance. He appeared in films, and his presence in Freaks produced one of the movie's most important effects. After several minutes, you stop looking at him purely as a curiosity. He becomes Johnny. That moment that might sound painfully obvious today, but in 1932, however, mainstream cinema rarely offered people with profound physical differences that visibility. Now, Daisy and Violet Hilton were conjoined twins and already experienced entertainment and entertainers before appearing in Freaks. Browning deliberately sought established performers, and Turner Classic Movies notes that the Hilton sisters were seasoned entertainers rather than simply people recruited because of their anatomy. Their presence gives us another interesting glimpse into how sideshow performers existed professionally. They weren't merely looked at, they performed, they developed routines, they interacted with audiences, they become public personalities. And in Freaks, Browning gives the sisters something remarkably mundane, romantic lives. They talk about relationships, they react emotionally to what happens to one another. Their scenes aren't presented entirely as medical spectacle. Their lives continue, and again, that normality matters. Now, Prince Randian was born without arms or legs and became a highly recognisable sideshow performer. In Freaks, he demonstrated an astonishing level of physical adaptation. Browning allows the audience to observe Randian, performing everyday actions using the body he is, rather than presenting some miraculous cinematic cure of pretending his disability does not exist. Now, there is something profoundly important about that. The cinema has historically loved two versions of disabled people: the tragic victim and the inspirational miracle. Freaks frequently offers something far stranger for its era: ordinary existence. Now, there's another performer in Freaks who had miraculously a microcephaly and spent much of his life performing in sideshows. The modern viewers need to approach historical descriptions of performers such as this one particular performer carefully, because much of the language used in sideshow advertising was deliberately sensationalized and sensationalistic and is now recognized as derogatory. The labels were marketing, the person beneath the label was real, and that distinction becomes central to understanding the entire history surrounding Freaks. Now, one fascinating element of circus history is how performers were frequently given stage identities. Their medical condition might become a part of the advertisement, their nationality might be exaggerated, their biography might be rewritten. A performer wasn't merely introduced by a name, they became the human skeleton, the living torso, the bearded lady, the half-boy, the Siamese twins, the pinhead. Now, the entire human being could be reduced to one characteristic that introduces the audiences who were becoming encouraged to stare at. And that language can feel grotesque today, but understanding it is essential, because Freaks was released into a society where those categories already existed in popular culture. Browning didn't invent the public fascination, he pointed a camera at it. Now, here is where Freaks becomes deeply ironic. The movie encourages sympathy towards people who are excluded because of their bodies, just very much like I was saying. Yet accounts of the production indicate that some cast members themselves experienced discomfort and segregation around MGM. Historical accounts describe resistance among people working at the studio to the presence of the sideshow performers. Now think about what that means. They were good enough to appear in an MGM movie, but their presence could still make supposedly respectable Hollywood uncomfortable. That contradiction tells us far more about society than it does about the performers. And Hollywood wanted their differences on screen. It wasn't necessarily comfortable encountering that difference during lunch. Just very much like I was saying, normal people on the street now and see people with a disability and they laugh at them. It still happens today. But please don't do that. Put yourself in their shoes and think about it again. Don't be a judgmental arsehole. Just saying. Now, the reaction was extraordinary. Test screenings were disastrous. Audiences reportedly walked out. Stories circulated about people becoming ill or fainting. The film was subsequently shortened. The BFI states that much of as approximately 30 minutes was removed from Freaks. That footage is now considered lost, which means the version of Freaks we analyse today isn't necessarily the complete film Browning originally intended audiences to experience. This is one of those frustrating pieces of cinema history, where censorship doesn't merely prevent contemporary audiences from seeing something. It permanently alters the historical record. The original ending was considerably harsher. The surviving film already contains the famous sequence in which the performers pursue Cleopatra and Hercules during a violent storm. Cleopatra ultimately suffers a grotesque transformation. But material removed from the film reportedly made Hercules' fate considerably more explicit, while other sequences and portions of the original ending disappeared during MGM's restructuring of the picture. The surviving version therefore gives us only a part of Browning's original version, and yet even the shortened version was considered too much. The British censorship history of Freaks is particularly fascinating. The film was initially submitted to British censors in 1932 and refused a certificate. That effectively prevented normal cinema exhibition. And the controversy didn't disappear after a few years. It was submitted again in 1952. It was rejected again. According to the BBFC's own historic case study, officials believed that the movie commercially exploited disabled people despite claiming to dignify them. The argument is fascinating because it remains part of the conversation surrounding the film today. Is Freaks compassionate or exploitative? The British authorities originally decided exploitation outweighed whatever social argument Browning was attempting to make, but history wasn't finished with the film. In May of 1963, Freaks was submitted to the British censors again. This time, the proposed release was deliberately restrained. The distributor wanted an adult audience to determine whether the film was exploitative or whether it was actually arguing for compassion towards its performers. The BBFC finally granted the movie an X certificate. 31 years after Freaks had been made, British audiences could finally legally encounter the film through normal classified exhibition. And something remarkably happened. The cultural conversation had started changing. Today, Freaks occupies an almost completely different cultural position. The BFI recognises its importance. Film historians study it. Horror scholars discuss it. Disability represented scholars debate it. Restorations and home video releases have introduced it to generations who weren't alive when audiences supposedly fled its screenings. The BBFC's contemporary assessment acknowledges that while the movie contains discriminatory language and reflects historical prejudice, its disabled characters are themselves upset by discrimination, and the overall representation can be understood within its historical context. That transformation is extraordinary. The bodies haven't changed. The movie hasn't suddenly become less confrontational. We've changed. Or perhaps more accurately, our language and understandings have changed. This is the question you should not have a lazy answer for. Yet, is Freaks exploitative? Yes, there are exploitative elements surrounding Freaks. Its title alone uses terminology we would reject when describing disabled people today. To me, they're just people. They're just ordinary people living their ordinary lives, only they have a physical disability, and there's people out there that judge these people. Its title alone uses terminology, again, that we reject when describing disabled people today. The marketing history of sideshow performers frequently reduced individuals to their physical differences. The climax deliberately uses these performers to generate horror and threat. There are moments where the camera undeniably knows that audiences are fascinated by unusual bodies. Pretending otherwise would be dishonest. By reducing the entire movie to exploitation creates another problem, because the disabled performers are also given community. Friendship, romance, sexuality, humour, jealousy, agency, loyalty, anger and revenge. They aren't simply helpless victims waiting for a conventionally attractive protagonist to save them. In fact, the people with conventional Hollywood bodies are responsible for some of the film's greatest cruelty. That reversal is precisely what makes Freaks fascinating. But there is another psychological layer to Freaks that deserves attention. That movie observes us. Imagine seeing these performers in 1932. Many audience members would never previously have encountered someone with those particular physical conditions outside a sideshow. Their initial reaction might have been shock, curiosity, discomfort, fear, even disgust. But then Browning keeps the camera rolling, and something happens. The unfamiliar becomes familiar. The human oddity becomes a character. The body becomes a person. The spectacle becomes somebody eating dinner, arguing with their partner, or laughing with their friends. That psychological transition may explain why freaks remain so powerful. The audience's gaze becomes part of the movie. Now, why do humans stare at physical difference? There is an uncomfortable psychological reality behind a sideshow culture. Human beings notice difference. Our attention is naturally attracted towards unfamiliar visual information. But curiosity and dehumanization are not the same thing. Noticing somebody is different is not inherently cruel. That's like walking through the street and noticing someone has dwarfism, or noticing someone with a physical other disability. What matters is what happens afterwards. Do we become curious about the person, or do we reduce the person to the difference? Historical sideshows frequently encouraged the second response. The advertisement effectively told audiences, "Come and look at this body." Freaks, at its most interesting, gradually changes that invitation. Come and meet this person. That difference is enormous. Now, why Freaks belongs in the conversation about extreme cinema? Well, I think Freaks deserves a place in conversations surrounding extreme cinema precisely because extremity changes across generations. Extreme cinema isn't simply a competition over which filmmaker can show the most blood. Something about this genre becomes extreme when it attacks cultural boundaries. And in 1932, Freaks attacked several. It placed disabled and physically different performers at the centre of a major studio production. It portrayed them as sexual and romantic beings. It created a community among them. It showed discrimination against them. It turned conventional beauty into moral ugliness. It allows its marginalised characters to retaliate. And then it confronted mainstream audiences with bodies that contemporary society had taught them to regret as spectacle and regard as spectacle. That was transgressive, perhaps more transgressive than another gallon of fake blood could ever have been. Now, the easy interpretation of Freaks is that the climax transforms the sideshow performers into monsters. I think stopping there misses the point. The real horror begins much earlier. It exists when Cleopatra realises Hans has money and decides his life is disposable. It exists when physical difference becomes justification for humiliation. It exists when kindness is mistaken for weakness. It exists when somebody believes another person's body makes them less human. And perhaps, most disturbingly, it exists outside the movie. It exists in audiences who paid money to stare at disabled people. It exists in industries that turn medical conditions into advertising slogans. It existed in workplaces that excluded people because of their bodies and because they looked different. And it existed in a society that could watch fictional monsters without complaint but struggle to look at real human difference. This is a contradiction at the heart of Freaks. The film also forces us to confront the idea of normality itself. Who decided what normal human body looks like? Statistically common does not mean morally superior. Yet throughout history, humans have repeatedly transformed physical averages into social hierarchies. The further somebody's appearance moves from the expected template, the easier society has sometimes found it to transform curiosity into exclusion. The sideshow monetized that exclusion. and Hollywood inherited some of it. Freaks simultaneously participates in that history and criticises it. That contradiction is exactly why the movie remains worth discussing. A perfectly political correct Freaks made in 1932 would probably tell us considerably less about 1932. That uncomfortable material is part of the historical evidence. Perhaps the most important thing we can do when discussing Freaks today is something extraordinarily simple. Use their names. Harry Earles, Daisy Earles, Daisy Hilton, Violet Hilton, Johnny Eck, Prince Randian, Olga Roderick, Frances O'Connor, Martha Morris, Josephine Joseph, Peter Robinson, and all of the other actors in this movie. They weren't special effects. They weren't monsters. They weren't imaginary creatures invented by Tod Browning. They were performers. And for some of them, Freaks preserves an extraordinary cinematic record of a form of entertainment in a community that has largely disappeared. That alone makes the movie historically invaluable. So for more than 90 years after its release, Freaks still leaves us with the same uncomfortable question. Who exactly deserves that title? Hans because he has dwarfism? Johnny Eck because his body developed differently? Prince Randian because he had no limbs? Daisy and Violet Hilton because they were conjoined? Or Cleopatra, who was physically beautiful according to conventional standards, but is prepared to manipulate, humiliate, and murder another human being for money? This is where Tod Browning's film becomes far more intelligent than its notorious reputation suggests. The physical difference is visible. The moral deformity isn't. And perhaps that was what audiences found so uncomfortable. Freaks initially invites the viewer to stare at people. Then it quietly begins asking why they are staring. It invites us into a world historically built around spectacle and gradually reveals communities underneath it. And finally, it turns the gaze back towards the audience. For a film made in 1932 that is remarkably confrontational, this is also why I don't believe extreme cinema should ever be defined purely through gore, violence, or sexual content. Extremity depends upon context. What shocks one generation becomes acceptable to another. What one society bans can eventually become a recognised classic. Freaks demonstrates that perfectly. The film that Britain refused to classify in 1932 and again in 1952 was eventually given an X certificate in 1963. Decades later, the BBFC would classify it considerably more leniently, including a 12 classification for video in 2023. The film didn't fundamentally change, but society did. And underneath all of the circle tents, sideshow banners, sensational advertising, and controversy lies something surprisingly simple. People wanted to be treated like people. That should never have been radical. In 1932, apparently it was. And that is why Freaks deserves to be remembered not simply as a notorious horror movie, but as one of the strangest, most uncomfortable and historically significant examinations of the human gaze ever produced by mainstream Hollywood. So with that episode coming in at 44 minutes, I hope you enjoyed this podcast and a little bit of the history surrounding Freaks by Tod Browning, and also a little bit of a glimpse into the movie. And also Tod Browning himself. Now, if you would like to pop me a message over on either Facebook, Instagram, or my email for any features in my podcast. If you are a director, an actor, special effects artist, musician, and you would like to get in touch, or if you would like to get in touch with me relating to an ex podcast I've done, or about Lucifer Valentine, I've had a few of them, you can message me either on Facebook, which is just simply Sensory Stowers, and I am in my profile picture on Facebook in a black outfit with a black mask. My hair is hanging down, and it is the backdrop for Antichrist. If you would like to follow me on Instagram in my Extreme Cinema page, it is simply, again, Sensory Stowers, the same profile picture, and my other Instagram, which is my music page, which is Sensory of Crimson Control. My email is sensorystowers@gmail.com if you would like to contact me over there. So, without further ado, I'm not going to take much more of your time today. I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you did, give it a thumbs up wherever it's shared on social media. Give it a share to all your friends and family. Again, this is a sort of movie that is an extreme cinema. However, anybody can watch it with an educational purpose. So this is a great movie to start off with people, because like I mentioned, it can make some people uncomfortable, whatever the case might be. But please, as a side note, once again, if you are out in public and you see somebody with a physical disability, please don't judge them. In fact, if they're close enough to you, have a little chat with them. Tell them, give them a compliment, and you will feel so good about yourself. Trust me. But other than that, I'm going to go. Thank you for listening, sickos, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye.